Does your footage look like this? Well, I hope it's not that bad because blown out footage tends to be difficult to recover. But first, let's save you some time in post and learn how to properly adjust exposure. There are 4 main ways to adjust your exposure: iris or f-stop, shutter speed or shutter angle, ISO or gain, and ND filters. Each of these methods have benefits and trade-offs, so it's important to understand them before you start shooting. Adjusting your iris changes the entrance diameter of your lens, letting more or less light into the lens, increasing or decreasing your depth of field, which, to put it simply, is how much your lens can focus on different things at different distances at the same time. A lower f-stop means more light is let into the lens, increasing exposure and making depth of field shallower. A wider f-stop means less light, giving you a wider depth of field with less exposure. Shutter speed is the amount of time light is let into the camera per frame, and shutter angle is the amount of time light is let into the camera relative to your frame rate. For example, if your frame rate is 30 frames per second and your shutter angle is 360 degrees, your shutter speed would be 1/30th of a second. Setting it to 180 degrees would change our shutter speed to 1/60th of a second. Remember, this number varies depending on your frame rate, so 180 degrees at 60 frames per second is going to be considerably darker than the same image at 30 frames per second. A faster shutter speed results in less motion blur and less exposure, whereas a slower shutter speed gives you more motion blur and more exposure. Generally, you should set your shutter speed to twice your frame rate. We call this the 180-degree rule for the most natural-looking motion blur. Changing your ISO changes the sensitivity of the digital image sensor inside the camera. Increasing your ISO increases the exposure, but also adds noise. For the cleanest image quality with minimal noise, try to keep your ISO as close to your camera's native ISO as you can. Each camera's native ISO is different, and you can look up your camera's native ISO on the internet. Finally, ND filters are like sunglasses for your camera. Adding ND filters decreases exposure with no major downsides, meaning unlike iris, shutter angle, or ISO, this is as close as you can get to a no trade-off solution, and it should be your first line of defense in case you're filming outside and your image is too bright. However, not every camera has built-in ND filters, but you can buy separate ND filters that attach to the end of your lens or a matte box. If your footage is clipping, or if the signal is pure white, it's generally unrecoverable, unless you record it in a higher bit depth or a RAW format. Essentially, more bit depth means more information about your picture's color is getting stored in your video. Oftentimes at higher bit depths, that information is beyond what your human eyes can see. So if that footage ends up too bright, then the extra information comes in handy when you need to recover otherwise lost data. Speaking of recovering lost data, I think now's a good time to see it in action. To the lab!
Let's have a look at some clips. We have 2 clips here, and both clip number 1 and clip number 2 are on the darker side, and they're a bit hard to see. We have clip number 1, which is almost identical to clip number 2, but we'll notice some differences here, and that difference lies in the format. Right now I'm in Adobe Premiere Pro's Color Workspace, and in the top left corner we have this tab called Source under the Effect Controls. We can see there's some options here that allow us to change color and exposure. I'm going to click on clip number 2 on the timeline, and the Source tab's options are blank. The only options for color control on this clip are in the settings on the right. So, what's the difference, I hear you ask? So this is a RAW video file, which is often produced by higher-end mirrorless cameras and essentially every cinema camera. Because it's a RAW video file, you get extra controls that allow you to change the RAW camera settings in post through the Source tab. Clip number 2, though, is a standard 8-bit MP4 file, which is produced by almost every camera. Because of that, we don't get the RAW camera controls in the Source tab, and we're forced to use Premiere's correction tools on the right. So let's fix these 2 clips up. I'll start with clip number 1, the RAW clip, since it does require some special handling. You have your RAW options on the left and Premiere's regular options on the right, but as I've explained earlier, RAW records more information, so to recover the RAW information, we'll go into the source tab and crank up the exposure until we can see what's going on. We can see that we've recovered Ivan here nicely. Things that used to be black, like the window in the back, are now visible. It's a little noisy though, admittedly, since you can zoom in and you see a little bit of nasty grain. It's time to fix clip number 2. This poor clip was unfortunately recorded in 8-bit, which, FYI, it'll be good for you to check your camera's settings in particular to see if it can record in higher bit depths or in RAW, so you can avoid 8-bit accidents like these. Let's turn the exposure up on this clip. Since we have no RAW controls in this MP4 file, we're forced to use the controls on the right. Turn up the exposure and... ooh, that's ugly. Things that used to be black are still black, which is a sign that you've lost information and you can't recover it. That window I pointed out earlier in the back is the same, even after making it brighter. Our picture is a lot noisier too, there's ugly grain all over it. I'm now going to use the other sliders here to make it look a little bit better, since for the 8-bit clip, just the exposure slider isn't going to fix it all. Namely contrast, since that will help bring back some of the blacks that we've taken away. We can also use the shadows in the black slider too, turning it down and balancing the darker parts of the image. We can also use the highlights and white slider. That balances the brighter parts and the brightest parts of the image respectively. Now, is this better than how it was before? I'll leave that to your own judgment, but me personally, I would just reshoot that clip and get the settings right. I'm going to do the same thing to 2 more clips which are too bright. We have clip number 1, which is RAW, which we can see because we get the source tab with the RAW options. And the other one is an MP4 recorded at 8-bit. I'll recover the RAW clip first, since once again in the source tab we can have the options to crank the exposure down. By doing this, we pulled some of the information out of what would otherwise be pure white. We can fine tune it some more, and we've recovered it nicely. You can see details like Ivan's forehead, and the concrete is nice and visible. I'll try the same thing with the MP4. You can see by turning down the MP4, some of our colors are permanently stuck on white, and we can only pull grays out instead of any meaningful data, which really sucks. Ivan's forehead and the concrete looks really ugly here. We can see no details at all. The examples I showed here were particularly bad, and in a normal situation, your footage wouldn't be this off. But hey, when the circumstances are right, now you know how to fix your exposure in post.
Well, that's all for this episode. Keep an eye out for episode 3 of Fix It in Post, Stabilization. Till next time.